Sabah al-Khair, good morning dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni and Yusuf Ahmed al-Rimawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Good morning, Robert. How are you doing?
So I'm very, very well. Thank you very much. Good morning, listeners. And what have we got on today? I know we've got a very, very exciting guest that you and I know very, very well.
We've got one of our dear and most special friends, Associate Professor Dr. Peter Slezak from the University of New South Wales. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Nasser. Good morning, Robert. Thanks for having me on.
Good seeing you again.
Likewise.
/ hearing from you.
Well, I can see you through the screen.
Peter, we've been asking our most recent interviewees just how they came to Palestine. Can you take us through your Palestine journey? How did you get to here?
Look, it's an interesting question to try and figure that out. If I think backwards, I think one relevant thing to say, given that I'm Jewish, I was sort of lucky that I was brought up in a household that wasn't Zionist particularly. They weren't anti-Zionist. My parents were Jews that were Holocaust survivors. Half of my family were in Israel. In fact, it's relevant to say that my mother's cousin, my closest family that was still here in Australia, he was the head of the JNF in Australia for many years, the federal head of the JNF. I've got a picture of him with Ben Gurion. So I had this sort of family that had good Jewish and Zionist credentials, but my parents, for example, never sent me to summer camp, and I thought I was missing out. They were always Zionist summer camps that all my friends went to. So I didn't get the Zionist indoctrination when I was a kid. I was just left alone. In fact, I still remember vividly a school friend of mine who was a very Orthodox Jew. When we were about 12, I've written about this in an autobiographical piece. He asked me, am I Zionist? And I was embarrassed. I had no idea what it meant when I was 12. So, I mean, I can answer him now a few years later.
Yeah.
And the answer is no. But so that was one part of it. But more positively, how I came to it, because I didn't have the prior prejudices and the indoctrination, I started reading. I mean, when I was a kid, I first read Bertrand Russell. That opened my mind to a more liberal, humane view of the world. And then, I mean, to cut a long story short, inevitably, because I started studying Chomsky's work, I started to read alternative views of Israel and Palestine from the one that we all grew up with. And it was starting to bother me that there were these alternative accounts. And the further I read his references, as you can now understand, a whole different world opened up about what had happened, which already long before Chomsky and Finkelstein and these critics was already being discussed by some Jewish historians like Lenny Brenner and various others, and other journalists. And so I started to see an alternative, and I wasn't resistant to it in the sense that I didn't feel that these had to be somehow crazy. So increasingly, partly because I was studying Chomsky's work, I also got caught up in reading his political work. And it was part of a broader understanding of the world. I mean, he was very important in the resistance to the Vietnam War and later East Timor, and I got caught up in that activism. So inevitably, my path went, and part of it, I should say, is I ended up dropping out. I was kicked out of Sydney University for failing too much in those days because I was interested in too many other things. But that led me to a kind of a path to the New South Wales University, where it was during the 60s, and I was caught up in the anti-war Vietnam stuff. And so while all my friends went off and did medicine and law and became successful professionals, and this was the Jewish community, friends I grew up with, I ended up with this radical lefty crowd. And my view of the world was clearly influenced by those sorts of differences. And to this day, they're all hanging out together and are pro-Israel and strongly Zionist for the most part. So that's the sort of short version of it, I guess.
Great story.
Yeah, great story, and we love you being on our team anyway. Now, Peter, the main reason we've got you on here, we've had a seminal piece, Peter Beinart, who arguably is, Jewish Zionist royalty, the most august, perhaps, Jewish journalist in America. He's a professor. He's written a 7,000-word treatise on the one-state solution.
Yeah.
Now, before we ask for your comments on the piece, I mean, the reality, and you've had to suffer this, he knew what was coming. I mean, it took a huge amount of courage, and we don't want to underestimate the importance of the piece, but You know, the Anti-Defamation League's called him a capo. Dershowitz calls him a Nazi.
That's right.
It's no small feat to step out in the first instance.
Yeah. Look, and also I should add that he wrote a short version in the New York Times, because the first one was in a Jewish magazine, and that's very important, which I'll get back to, because I think that's what's important about his impact. But the New York Times piece has also had a huge impact.
Can I just ask on Peter Beinart, so our listeners might be interested, has he been anti-Palestinian, or has he been just pro-Israel with it?
It's a good question. He's certainly not anti-Palestinian. You can read what he's been saying for very many years. It's just that he was very Zionist, and he was, very Jewish. He's a good Jew and a good Zionist, and as Nasser said, he was kind of royalty in the sense that he still prays every day. He does all of the Jewish rituals. This is something I want to come back to explain his importance, because I think a lot of Palestinians haven't understood. I can see from online, they have some good reasons to be angry, but I think they're missing what has been the importance of Beinart. But it's because he's been absolutely outstandingly committed Jew and Zionist. But he has long ago not spoken harshly of the Palestinians. It's just that he never went far enough. In fact, today, if we're jumping ahead a little bit, one of the questions I was saying to one of my Jewish friends is, okay, he's taken a very significant step, but you might ask, what took you so long? So if you want to be critical of, but I don't want to be critical of Beinart. Given who he is and where he's coming from, he's not where I am. He's not where a lot of Jews that I've mentioned are, like Finkelstein and Chomsky and Amira Haas and Gideon Levy, and I can name a dozen that are much further along in this pro-Palestine.
It's a journey, isn't it?
Law. So let me give you another example. When he came to Australia many years ago, what's interesting is when we bring out, with our various solidarity groups, speakers, Jewish or Israeli, the Jewish community never comes to those speakers because they know that they're coming, from a certain point of view. But Beinart came out many years ago, brought out by one of the Jewish organizations, and he got a big Jewish audience. And he didn't speak at the time about BDS, but he was asked about it. And he said a couple of very important things, which he's talking about today. So he said, look, what do you expect of the Palestinians? When they resorted to violence and suicide bombing, you condemned them, and rightly. And he says, now they resort to peaceful, non-violent resistance, to popular resistance. Now, how dare you criticize them? Now, that was an interesting thing to say, especially to a Jewish audience, about BDS, which is still a red line for Jews. He was sympathetically showing that, and today he talks this way in that article, the Palestinians are showing what is not anti-Semitism. He's saying this is typical of national liberation movements. This is a resort to the kind of freedom struggle for rights, which you can see in other cases around the world. This is a very important point to be making, partly because the Jewish community have so demonized Palestinians, and he points that out. Mm-hmm. He knows better than anyone. So in answer to your question, he's certainly, on the contrary, one of the things I think is very significant is that he quotes the Palestinians he's been reading and he's friends with, Ali Abu Nima and Edward Said and others. This is very important because he's now giving voice to their concerns. And he speaks what's interesting is that your question is a very interesting one, because he talks about the Jewish roots of understanding of the Palestinians and the empathy and their rights and their being human beings. We think this is just obvious and it shouldn't have to be said, but coming from him, it has to be said. And he talks about how in the Jewish tradition, he makes that remark about how we have to be kind to the strangers in our midst because we were strangers once in Egypt. This is a famous line in the Old Testament. And having to say that to Jewish audiences, I think, is very important.
Yeah. You spoke a moment ago about the concern amongst the Palestinian community, and we'll come to that in a second. Yeah. The reality is, as I said, he's Jewish Zionist royalty. His voice is so magnified because of that stature.
Exactly.
And that's where the importance is, and that's where, whether it's the 7,000 words in the Jewish Chronicle or the 1,500 words or whatever it was in the New York Times, the impact of that into the Jewish community. When you and Anthony Lowenstein, etc., came out, you faced the barrage. Are you seeing anything, some green shoots here or in America?
Oh, yeah. Look, I was going to mention, I have alongside me, one of the things that's interesting in relation to Beinart is a book that Norman Finkelstein wrote. I can't remember the date, but it's maybe 5-10 years ago. I can check in a minute. But the book is titled "Knowing Too Much," and the subtitle is why the American Jewish romance with Israel is coming to an end. Now, Finkelstein wrote this years ago, and his point was, knowing too much, the Jewish community in America especially, this was written in 2012, they're mainly Democrat voters. They're progressive, as we say, on everything but Palestine, but they are progressive. They're at the forefront of the civil rights movements and other important human rights concerns. And as Beinart is aware, and we're very well aware, maybe some people don't realize, the Jewish community really have no idea about, firstly, from 48, what happened. They've got no idea about 67. That's why some of the historians like Ilan Pape and even Benny Morris and others are important. So Finkelstein is pointing out they're starting to find out, and they can't reconcile it with their progressive values generally. In Australia, there are signs. Beinart, for example, was the subject of discussion at a synagogue here by one of their more progressive rabbis, and they've even had Izzat Abdul Hadi come to the synagogue. One of our Palestinian friends, Hilmi Dabar, was invited. I was pleased to be part of organising that to a synagogue, another synagogue. So there are signs, not from the leadership, mind you, not from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry or the Jewish Board of Deputies or the Zionist organisation, but the ferment inside the Jewish community is evident. And Beinart is an important boost to those dissenting opinions and discomfort that people are starting to feel, because they're starting to find out, believe it or not, what they haven't known about how bad things are. That's quite a phenomenon, by the way, how they can remain ignorant. But that's part of the reality.
Well, it's a crack in the dam, isn't it?
Absolutely. And Beinart's the biggest impact. I mean, look, you can see, you made the point a moment ago, even Beinart is dismissed, of course, straight away by people like Dershowitz. I was just watching an interview with him, just vitriolic, just malicious. He's dismissing Beinart and actually called him a Nazi. Well, I mean, this is so crazy.
Did he go as far as calling him a Nazi?
Yeah, he does. He used the word, he's recommending the final solution. I mean, those words.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, no, he used that. And this interview on one of these Jewish online programs, I mean, he just like loses it completely. He's just over the top. He's so crazy. But this is very significant. And so, as Nasser was pointing out, other dissenters, and I experienced that as well, they're immediately cast aside as being crazy or self-hating or something. And so the Jewish community is protected from taking them seriously. We're banned from speaking, as I'm rather proud of having been banned from the annual conference. After I spoke there a couple of times, they decided there was a red line, which was BDS, and so on and so on. But you see, what's his name? Beinart is harder to dismiss that way, because he's been a good Jew. He's been a good Zionist. I never was. You know, a lot of the dissenting figures, they've got good Jewish credentials, or like Finkelstein Holocaust parents, and like Ilan Pape, Gidon Levy, and Amira Haas. They've been sidelined, and Beinart is too hard to plausibly dismiss.
Yeah.
And because look, you know, he speaks from the heart about his Jewishness. He speaks of love, and he speaks of his love for the Jew, in spite of the flack that he's been getting. He understands it, and he even says in his article that he knows that this is like spitting in the face. He says, that's his words, into the Jews that he loves. And he wants to speak in ways. Now, I never spoke like that. I mean, you know, I have much less feelings of that sort, you know, but he cares about his Jewishness and his Jewish roots. So that's why he's harder to deal with. Yeah.
He starts the article with Yavne, you know, a Jewish case, you know.
Yes,
it goes back hundreds of millennia.
Yes.
One of the things that interestingly he talks about in the article is the concept of the Holocaust lens.
That's right.
And because the dehumanization of the Palestinians is such that every Palestinian is vilified as being a rampant anti-Semite.
That's right.
And that the only reason we've got a challenge with the Jews is because they're Jews.
That's
completely dismissing the whole concept of a settler colonialist enterprise.
That's right.
And the power of his voice into that community, humanizing us and saying, well, hold on a second, 20% of the population of Israel as it is today are Palestinian.
That's
the
right.
statistics on terrorism or violence of those is significantly less than everybody else's.
Well, it's practically zero. That's right.
And so you say, when there's that political engagement, when you humanize them and they're part of the society, that's what you get.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's a very important point you make. And I'm always embarrassed to repeat or to emphasize the point that you've made, but I think it's important for people outside and Palestinians to understand the degree to which there's a racist, supremacist hatred from the Jews of the Palestinians. They've been driven into this awful. I mean, Israel is awash with a kind of racist stuff. You only see these vox pops that they do, and kids in the street and others will say we should just drop a bomb on them all. And it's actually terrifying. And I think, frankly, that's one of the biggest problems of Beinart's ideal of a binational state. It's the attitudes of the Jews through their education. The wonderful Israeli woman, I think, Robert, you talked to her, Nurit Alhanan Peled.
Yeah, she was fantastic.
Yeah, and you did a very good interview with her. She said some great stuff. She looks at the education of the Israelis and how deeply they're caught up in this demonization of the Palestinians. That's a serious issue. I mean, one example which we've all experienced, when you travel in the West Bank, there's that great big red and white sign that says this is dangerous. It's the area.
Yeah, it's illegal for Palestinians to enter under Israeli law.
Yeah, to come in, and you're in fear of your life there. And I was very pleased when I was traveling around there with the filmmaker who was making a bit of a documentary. Everywhere I went, he was pleased to introduce me as a professor of philosophy, but also as a Jew. And I got the most wonderful reactions there.
Yeah.
And we filmed some of that. And I keep telling people that you have to understand, because every Jew thinks that if they're going to go into Palestine, the West Bank, I mean, they're going to be murdered. And I've got a wonderful scene in that where I deliberately went into a barber shop. I'd had a shave that morning, but I thought it'd be a lovely visual gag. I'll have the barber give me a shave, and he's got the big blade on my neck. And I made a joke saying, I thought this might be my last moment in Palestine, after I'd been introduced as a Jew. I mean, look, it's obviously a joke because
that's gold.
You have to be there to find the enormous one. And look, of course, if you come in an IDF uniform, that's a bit different. But at the demo I was at in Bilayin, most of the people there were actually Jews. They'd come across, the Israelis come across to join the demo on that Friday. And so, but you see, this is the first time I was there, we were in East Jerusalem, and we met Ruth Pollard, who'd been a very good journalist from there. And she said something to me. She said, look, the Jews, the Israelis are all frightened. They're fearful of the Palestinians. They're all going to be murdered. And I said, it's bullshit. And she said, yeah, it's bullshit, but it's true. So in other words, this fear of that's been whipped up, and as you said, they've all been made to think that they're all Nazis. Now Beinart is talking about that. He's talking about the need to humanize the Palestinians. This is not a small task, but I think it's very important. And you see that here in the diaspora too. You can't. I mean, they don't know Palestinians. They've never talked to any. So that's the way prejudice works.
So important that he does it. I want to emphasize as much as I can. He's actually speaking to Jews that we've never had a chance to speak to, Peter.
That's right. That's the
and that's the power of this message.
Yeah, and he'll say to them, as in the article, in fact, at one point he said, "Look, when you've got views about what the Palestinians think, have you ever asked one? Talk to one. So yeah, I think this is important. He has an audience. In fact, there was a thread on Twitter which I copied out, and he makes the important point. We'll perhaps come back to the point we've mentioned about the Palestinians' reaction to him. He understands that, of course, that there was a kind of a frustration with him, to put it no more strongly. But he makes a point among the others he made in this thread. He says, look, he first of all explains that, of course, the Palestinian voices have been suppressed and they've been, marginalized and so on and so on. But he makes the point that, firstly, he's uncomfortable about the fact, I'll read it. He says, the problem persists and in some ways has been magnified by the attention I've gotten for making an argument about one. So he understands that he magnified this fact that it's a Jew that's speaking and the Palestinian voices have been neglected. But he says, look, there is a legitimate role for intra-Jewish conversations in Jewish spaces, like the one I'm doing today. And that's, I think, the point, that we know that nobody wants to listen to Ali Abu Nima or Yusuf Munayr or,
they're just not going to get the platform into a synagogue, whether it be progressive or otherwise. Or
that's right. And to his credit, Beinart points out he has, for a long time, been advocating. I'll read a bit more. He says, "I've spoken about this problem repeatedly, especially to Jewish audiences. In virtually every talk, I implore listeners to read, to listen to, and interact with Palestinians." So, I give him credit for this. He's not just, as some, I think Palestinians haven't understood it, they were sort of angry with him, and I think they were right about the concern of being marginalized, but Beinart is doing something that nobody else could have done.
Yeah, no question. And, I'm guilty. Like the first thing, I remember reading the article, being amazed at its power and its, the strength of it, and his courage. I mean, I know to just the struggle that he must have gone through, having heard bits and pieces from, Jewish friends.
Mm.
But, my first reaction was, but we've been saying this for years.
That's
whether we had Diana Bhutto out here, whether we've had Noura Erakat, we've had,
absolutely.
Palestinians, Gula Ali Abu Nima, Sari Makdisi, we've had that many Palestinians in Australia, and I know many of them have come from the States speaking to this, but here we are, suddenly a white Jewish boy says it, and boom, New York Times, boom.
That's right. But of course, you're absolutely right, Nasser, as I know, because I was part of all these visits. How many Jews came to any of those talks? We know all 5 of them, I think.
We know all 5, that's right. Yeah. Let's just close off the Holocaust lens thing. I just want to quote from his article, because this was so particularly powerful, really poignant for me. He says, "The depiction of Palestinians as compulsive Jew haters stems less from Palestinian behavior than from Jewish trauma.
That's right.
As the late Israeli scholar Yehuda Elkanah, a Holocaust survivor himself, has observed, what motivates much of Israeli society in its relations with the Palestinians is a particular interpretation of the lessons of the Holocaust. But this Holocaust lens distorts how Palestinians actually behaved, not like genocidal Jew haters, but rather like other peoples seeking national rights."
Exactly. Look, I think he exaggerates the Holocaust. Well, how can I put this rightly? They've been persuaded, constantly reinforced to think this way. I mean, there was the Israeli member of the Knesset, I'm always quoting, you might have seen it, what's her name? I always block on her name. I'll think of it in a minute. Shulamit Aloni. She was a member of the Knesset, and there's a wonderful interview she did on Democracy Now!, where she says, the Holocaust, and anti-Semitism, it's the trick we always use to shut up, to silence criticism.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
So that's exactly the right way to sum it up. And it hardly needs to be said among ourselves, what's the Holocaust got to do with Palestine? It's hard to have to say that to people, because there's no answer to that. The Palestinians aren't to blame for the Holocaust. Why should they have to?
They're just getting punished for it.
Yeah, exactly.
Peter, one of the things that he doesn't really touch on in those 7,000 words, and it's the hardest topic to broach, arguably, when you're talking about a solution in the one state, is the right of return.
That's right.
Where do you think he's at with that?
I think you're right. I've noticed he does mention it in a couple of places, but you're right. I don't have a clear sense of what his view is. I think he'd probably say, at least my view is that, look, there's no question about the right of return. It's just a right, and you can't just take it away. I mean, it's enshrined in international law. I think everybody understands, though, it's not a simple problem to solve. I think the practical question is one that has to be faced, but you can't start this conversation by taking the right away from the Palestinians. That's the beginning point. And I think that's one of the things Jews have to confront too, among all the other realities and historical injustices they have to face. One of them is the right of return. I mean, look, the obvious thing for me to say is they also have to confront the fact that they give every Jew that's got nothing to do with Israel the right to go and live there. I've got more rights than the Palestinians who are still holding their keys. Yeah. That's the pointy end of this conversation, that the Jews can't live with that inconsistency and immoral asymmetry, and you can't give every Jew a right that the still living Palestinians whose houses are still there. So, okay, that's the beginning point. But then there's this very tricky question of how to actually deal with it. I've read people that have very sensible views about how this would work out. I mean, Abu Sita, who was here, Salman Abu Sita, who was here, I mean, he made the point, which I didn't quite know, is that most of the places from which the Palestinians had been evicted and expelled are uninhabited, even inside Israel. The villages that he was from and the ones that were expelled into Gaza and so on. That was rather interesting because he's made this unbelievable systematic study of every, exiled Palestinian and where they're from and the family and all that. He said, even inside Israel, this is not like displacing people from their houses and so on. So I don't have a clear sense of, in practice, I don't know even how many Palestinians will want to actually move back to Palestine. This is an interesting question. So, but I think
you're right. How many Jews actually want to go to Israel? But
that's not many. In fact, a lot are leaving. A lot are leaving.
But what you touched on it, Peter. The reality is you've got the right to, and nobody should deny my right either.
And we should repudiate that right. That's the first thing Israel should do. Yeah. And that's part of what, look, Beinart would probably agree, because his whole thesis is that you can't continue to regard this as a Jewish state. A homeland is one thing, and his version of Zionism has become, as it was for some people, look, you could move there if it was under appropriate conditions, rather than swamping the place with these waves of Jews and then taking most of the country away. There was some conceptions of Zionism which would be living in harmony with the Palestinians. That's where he is now. And so he'd probably agree. I mean, that's part of the whole point, that it shouldn't be any longer a Jewish state. It should be a homeland where you could move and live if you want to. I think that's a different way of thinking about it.
And that's what he's talking about. And in fact, the very first Zionists, Herzl, etc., were always talking about a homeland.
But look, to be fair, or to be honest about it, is my understanding of it, they really always intended it to be a state. They always intended to steal the land. If you go back, I've been struck by going back to some of these early Zionists. Herzl was quite explicit. He said, slowly, I think he's got some word about discreetly, we should get rid of the Palestinians. Ben Gurion, they were much more candid in those days. And in fact, the whole idea of Israel, Eretz Israel, was that they'll take the lot. And so they never really understood this as sharing it with the Palestinians. That's the tragic part of it.
Yeah.
And they were just much more candid about it. They didn't hide it. They weren't, pretending. And one of the things Beinart says, which I think is really important to point out, he's angry with those Zionists who have pretended to be supporting a two-state solution. Most of the Sydney, and other Jewish organizations that pretend to be Zionists, they're always bellyached about, we support a two-state solution, and they're bugger all to speak up for it when it was being destroyed.
Destroyed, yeah.
It was obviously being taken away, hundreds of thousands of settlers over a period. Not a peep about what you really need to do to protect the two-state solution. So it was the most cynical, hypocritical behaviour of these people who pretend that they were always supporting it, and the leading figures in the Jewish community are to be blamed in that way.
During the week, Peter, I don't know if you saw it, Seth Rogen, who's Canadian comedian, American comic, very funny guy. He came out and said on a podcast, I was fed a huge amount of lies about Israel.
I didn't know who Seth Rogen was, but I saw that. And
he does really dumb, silly movies,
Robert and I's sense of humour,
Yeah, maybe not you, Peter.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. But do you think that's a product of Peter Beinart, Seth Rogen?
I don't know whether Beinart probably came out roughly around the same time. But, for the reasons we've been saying, again, it's another very important public statement along the lines that I was saying before. They've got to wake up to the fact that everything that they've learned from 48 onwards has been a lie. It's amazing even for me, and I'm pretty used to it by now, but when I read about 1948 among these historians, how different, for example, I was just talking to one of my Jewish friends. The idea is that poor little fledgling Israel was declared on the 15th of May and they were invaded by all these Arabs. They were always militarily, the Israelis, the Jews then, they weren't Israeli, they were always militarily superior from the beginning to the end, in numbers, in training, in armaments. The idea that Israel was vulnerable was just a lie. And the historians are pointing that out. 67, Begin came out and admitted that they weren't really in any danger. It was a preemptive attack, thinking they could now get away with. Anyway, everything we've ever learned, and that's very tough and hard for the Jewish community to swallow, that everything they've been told, like this Seth Rogen guy is saying, that's quite a demand.
Yeah.
That's the end of the show. Thank you so very much, Peter, for joining us once again.
Thank you for the chance to talk with you.
Thanks, Peter. We'll have you again.
Good on you, Robert. Nice talking to you too. Thanks.
Fantastic. And wasn't that great to listen to Peter Slezak? Thanks for listening. Tell your friends, share the podcast, and remember, free Palestine.